Hi everyone and welcome to another episode of From the Lighthouse. I'm Stephanie and I'm here today with my lovely co-host Michelle. Hi Michelle.
Hi Stephanie.
So today Michelle and I are in the studio to talk about an author who we've both read and very much admire, and that author is Jeanette Winterson. So Michelle, you brought this topic to the podcast, so why don't you start off by introducing Jeanette Winterson as a writer?
Yeah, look, I think that a podcast on Jeanette Winterson's long overdue. It's been sort of probably more than 25 or so years since she won the Whitbread Prize for her Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. I think that she's one of those writers who combines both the ability to really write sort of prolifically, but at a high quality and, you know, sort of just in this way that I don't think many other writers today manage, because I think there's just something incredibly fearless about Winterson's projects. I think she writes in a way that is unafraid of flaunting convention, fashion, opinion. And I think she's such an eloquent speaker with such a phenomenal intellect that it would be remiss of us not to talk about somebody who has won, you know, sort of the Whitbread Prize, the Foster Award, Lambda Literary Awards. She has an OBE. She was in 2016 listed BBC's one of 100 women.
Top 100 women.
Top 100. Yep, the top 100 women. And of course, she is just a writer who, whenever I pick up one of her books, I'm in a state of pleasure, which I think is the absolute number one.
It's important, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
What I like about Jeanette, I like lots of things about Jeanette Winterson, but when I was thinking about this podcast on the way here, I was thinking about how many different genres she writes in. She's not an author you can kind of pigeonhole as having one style of writing or one particular mode of writing that she usually writes. She'll write, you know, semi-autobiographical things and memoir. She'll write really experimental novels. She'll write horror. I remember a few years ago reading a book that she wrote for the Hammer Horror series called The Daylight Gate. I think that's the correct title. And that was about the Lancashire witch trials in the 16th or 17th century, rather. She writes, I don't know, funny prose. She writes children's books. She writes pretty much in every kind of way or mode or genre you can imagine. And I was just looking quickly at her, and I have to confess, her Wikipedia page, just to get a sense of her bibliography and what year things were fit together. And the last thing she wrote was actually a book about Christmas, which is like, it's about like Christmas recipes and like stories about Christmas, which is so almost unexpected from somebody who can be so unconventional and bold and radical. And then she turns around and writes a book about like my favorite Christmas recipes. It seems odd, but it's entirely in keeping with the way that she kind of can do anything, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the things that sort of compels the reader through her books, is because although she's taking you places that you think can't exist, or she's taking you through characters that seem to be some strange contradiction, her sort of I guess it's her faith in something that is kind of very human. I think always triumphs in some way, shape or form. And I think in that way she ends up giving us characters and stories that really quite fundamentally change expectations, which to me is what great writers do.
I think she has a really overwhelming faith in the power of literature. So the most recent book that I read by her was her memoir, which has the absolutely brilliant title, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal? which was something that her mother actually said to her, and that's where she got that title from. That book is a memoir of her life growing up in a very, very conservative Christian household. Her mother, her adopted mother, who she calls Mrs. Winterson throughout the book, is very, very, very evangelical Christian. She's very conservative. She does things like she will run through drills with the young Jeanette about how to respond when the apocalypse and the four horsemen of the apocalypse come, like literal four horsemen of the apocalypse come to the town and the world ends, and like you have to hide under the stairs and eat beans and all of this sort of thing. And what really saves the young Jeanette in this book is reading and books. And she starts off at the local library because she's not allowed to have novels in the house because novels are sinful. The only book that she's got in the house is Jane Eyre, and Mrs. Winterson doctors the ending of Jane Eyre so that it looks like Jane marries St. John Rivers and goes to be a missionary rather than marries Mr. Rochester. So that's the only novel they have in the house. So she goes down to the local library and just starts reading through the novels from literally from A to Z. And the book is about her experiences growing up. It's about living with this really intense kind of religious environment, but it's also about literature and the capacity for literature to save her and to pull her out of her circumstances. And it's really a book about her love of language, her love of words, her love of literature, the power of literature, what literature can do for you. And so it ends up being quite a celebration, even though it's about what, when you read it, you think, oh God, what a weird childhood experience. It's actually very, I found it very hopeful and very affirming because it's about the value, the power of literature to kind of support her through those things.
Look, and I think Winterson is a fabulous speaker for that.
Yeah.
And I mean, she's certainly not sort of backward and coming forward about the degree to which she still classes herself as a missionary in many respects, which had been her intended, sort of the intended destiny for her to sort of go forth and find I think she actually says to find a hot country and proselytize. Yeah. And so she frequently makes allusions to sort of the degree to which she is and has become the missionary that she was sort of destined to become, but just as a sort of a literary clergy, I guess, in many respects. And I think one of the very first books that I read of Winterson was actually Sexing the Cherry. Yeah, which was for me just incredibly funny. It was this marvelous story which on first reading I read as a child again, because you've got the giant, the mother is a giant. She's hideous. It's set in 17th century London, with all of the sort of the teeming filth that goes along with that, and she's this immensely repugnant creature, but so fabulous that you love her. And then when you go back and you think through sort of the sort of stories that Winterson is drawing on in order to bring that sort of to bring that sort of character into being in a way that really transcends, I guess, in many respects, the traditional role of either giant or woman, or ogre or woman, because she's all of those things. She's ogre, she's this, but she's incredibly maternal. There's a uproarious sort of sex scene where I think she virtually kills somebody through sort of suffocating them in her vagina, sort of things. So, it's because she is those are her dimensions. That
makes sense.
Absolutely. She is so enormous, and of course is left utterly cold by the whole sex thing, because it was just that sort of non-event. which when you sort of go through and you think about some of the things that Winterson is doing with her writing, is she is challenging some of those ideas that we're supposed to be, in some respect, shaping our lives according to, you know, and I think and she's doing it in a way that makes you laugh.
Yeah, and she brings like that. She has a real comprehensive knowledge of folk and fairy tales and story in all its kind of the Bible especially, and she brings all of those influences into something like Sex and the Cherry, which I also read many years ago and don't have particularly strong memory of the plot, but I remember absolutely loving it and thinking it was playful and magical and funny and irreverent and all. It's very subversive, but it's also, as you say, a really fun read, which you think, how do you do all that in one book?
Well, look, and I think the way that she introduces this sense of the strangeness of the fruit, and you know, I don't, even though it's been a long time since I've read it as well, I don't think I'll ever lose that image of I think it was the pineapple that was just so completely defamiliarized for me through seeing this as a strange encounter. And I think the way she deploys the notion of journey and exploration through her stories, and funnily enough, you know, written on the body, which is one of her texts, which I think you definitely talk about as experimental. The narrator is never in any way definitively gendered. There's this sort of, you know, that there's a lot of linguistic play that goes into creating a character that to a narrator that you can never actually identify as either male or female. But one of the things that I think I was struck most by was that even though it was the one that was perhaps most stationary in terms of staying within, I think, you know, sort of the London area, the England area, within a particular time frame, and so many of her stories are so loose in where they will move and where they'll go, was that there was this incredible sense of journey through that story. And I think it's the story that most, for me, that I've read of Winterson's, that most reminded me of Orlando. In this way that I think through the picking up of and the sort of the very sort of enforced interiority of that piece and that sort of intimate narration. Was really such a tremendous feat. And of course, one of the things that happens too often in feminist literature and with writers who will so proudly and loudly, you know, sort of proclaim their feminism, is that the charge of misandry is levelled at them. What do you think about the way?
I quite like some ironic misandry. I think, you know, the world needs a little bit of that. I think, well, look, I think it's just a really easy way to take shots at women for writing about things that are of interest to women. I think it's a refusal. It indicates, I suppose, a refusal to actually meet writers like Winterson where they are at, and instead just take shots from the side because they can't actually engage with the ideas and the challenges to kind of conventional ways of thinking about gender that Winterson presents. So I think it's just a way of coming at them that negates the actual work that they're doing. And I find it just tiresome and stupid. I mean, no one makes these comments about works that are really interested in men and are often really, really misogynist. That doesn't seem to be an issue. But when women write about women and play with gender in a very kind of playful and searching, interrogative way, then you get the cries of misandry. I just think it's tiresome and stupid.
Well, I think also that, especially with a writer like Winterson, you actually can't ignore the fact that misandry is a strategy deliberately evoked, because you can't tell me that a writer with such, sort of profound, sort of knowledge of literature, of, sort of all of the vast bodies of knowledge that, sort of Winterson carries with her, isn't capable of recognising misandry in her own texts. So that if it's there, it's doing something. And I think that one of the things that can be difficult sort of for people to encountering sort of misandry is often the fact that misandry happens in a context where, in actual fact, misogyny reigns.
Yeah, exactly.
So in some...
We've had quite a few years of misogyny, yeah.
Well, that's right. So it actually becomes that strategy, and it becomes ironized. It becomes all of those sorts of things, so that it's drawing attention to the fact that if you don't like a little bit of jibing, sort of against men, if you don't like worlds where men are portrayed as ordinary, as sort of slightly inferior or greatly inferior,
or just kind of mediocre,
or mediocre, or just boring,
uninteresting,
incapable of acting in a way that's interesting. Well, then maybe you actually need to stop and think, well, how often is that the role that's ascribed the female character, or the female in the world? And I think that's where misandry works, because we do live in a world that is still very much sort of upholds it's not enough just to move on and let's everybody be nice to everybody, because that world is not yet upon us, and I think misandry is one of those sort of very powerful strategies that sort of allows discomfort to be felt, and then the astute reader questions and critiques that.
Well, I mean, how many works of literature in the world are there where women are presented in ways that minimise them, that present women as shallow and insignificant and stupid? I mean,
or
most
whose stories are just not worth hearing.
Yeah, exactly. They just exist in the story to prop up men, or to use Virginia Woolf's great way of phrasing this from A Room of One's Own. She talks about how women have just existed to reflect back men at themselves twice their size. So that's, I mean, we've got thousands of years of writing in which women are treated in that way. So if we have a few texts in which men don't come off all that well, then so be it, as far as I'm concerned.
And I think one of the books that I read most recently was actually Weight, which was Winterson's retelling of the Atlas myth, and it was part. She was invited to write for a particular sort of series by Canongate, and I think that's the sort of the measure of the writer who isn't sort of producing just what they want to produce, but is actually able to produce on demand. And of course, Atwood's excellent
she does
at
that
that.
as well.
There are lots of writers who do it brilliantly. Ali Smith, but sort of in this particular story, what you get is this really sort of beautiful, introspective Atlas who sort of has to actually come to understand that the weight that he's carrying around is in many respects the weight that he himself has generated for himself through memory and through history and the stories and the burdens and etc. Which is told with such it's told with such warmth and feeling and then just imaginative scope. The moment at which with I think an unfettered imagination is what I find, because it's as though anything can happen, and it does. So I love the moment, which I think is a particularly sort of Winterson moment, where the Russian dog, Laika, is actually scooped up and saved by Atlas to become, his companion, and that sort of willingness to break the rules of time, and to break the rules of, which is what myths have always done, haven't they?
Right. Yeah.
And I think that when Winterson does that, she always does that with that full acknowledgement that's the sort of the scientific rules of the universe and of proportion and the physical world have always sort of been discarded in the imagination and in our but also in our experience of the world, and so that impossibility of both one and the same time, the sort of enormous godlike characters who are both carrying the earth but then sort of walking on the earth, and all of those things that you sort of that the logical part of your brain wants to reject or resist, suddenly become the stuff of the imagination in the world that you take on when you pick up a book.
Yeah, and I think she's playing there. I've also read that, but it was years ago that I read that. But what struck me is that she's almost the perfect person to write a book about myth, because she is so playful and experimental. And I think in that book she really puts her finger on why we need myths, and why we continue to be interested in myths that are thousands of years old and that don't reflect the ways we think about the world anymore, but also do. She really understands, and I think that's again coming perhaps from a religious background. She really understands the power of story and mythology, and that sense of it feels sort of vaguely wrong to say this in relation to religion. Magic, because I think, a lot of, thinking about religion is thinking about things that break the boundaries of reality. So I think that she's actually a very well-placed person to think about magical realism, and to think about that refusal to just stay within the boundaries of kind of conventional realism, I suppose.
Well, I think it's also, that constant acknowledgement that in some sense the concerns of what it is to be human have in many respects remained consistent over time.
That's
and
right.
Sort of love, betrayal, sort of faith, and I think in that interview that I listened to, she sort of mentioned there are only 3 endings, and one of them's sort of tragedy, one of them is forgiveness, and what would the third one have been? Revenge. And she said, sort of the happy ending is a false one.
Yeah,
it's a constructed one. It's because we're constantly in flux. We
keep going on. Yeah.
So that it's a faux ending, and out of the 3, she sort of said forgiveness is the most interesting.
Actually, that ties into she wrote another kind of series that she wrote in is the Hogarth Shakespeare series, which is where a bunch of contemporary writers rewrite Shakespeare's plays as novels. And she was actually the first, from memory, she was the first one in the series. And so she wrote The Gap of Time, which was about the Winter's Tale. And the Winter's Tale isn't a particularly famous, or it's one of the Shakespeare's late kind of romances, and it's not particularly produced often or well known. But she chose that particular play because it's about a foundling, and she says, as an adopted child in this house that seemed to be so at odds with her kind of spirit or whatever, that she felt like a foundling. And that play is all about forgiveness. And she plays in The Gap of Time with those ideas of time, memory, dispossession, and ultimately forgiveness. And I don't know that I entirely was on board with that novel in the way that I have been on board with other Winterson plays, but she is very interested in that idea in the book of how you forgive immense betrayal and immense pain and suffering. So that is, I think, a recurrent theme in her work, which I think stretches back to her childhood and all of the sort of autobiographical stuff that she's done, but certainly comes out in The Gap of Time as one of the key kind of touchstones of her career, that idea of forgiveness.
Yeah, and I think in the opening of Atlas, of Weight, the opening of it sort of talks about sort of how much first person, how much I, dominates her writing, and there is that point that it's not about, sort of the I, the he, the she, so much as about the authenticity on the page and what it takes to reach that point of authenticity. And I think that one of the things that I'm so conscious about when reading Winterson is the degree to which, there is this sort of almost literary hierarchy which will sort of privilege particular genres, most often over memoir and autobiography, but also that in the instance that Winterson gives in a different podcast was the way that when someone like Paul Auster creates a character who runs parallel to his own life, it's called metafiction. Whereas when a woman does something similar, it's called autobiography, and it's not a value-free evaluation in a sense. There is a hierarchy in play right there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really ongoing kind of discussion in discussions of women's literature, the way that women's novels are often read through the lens of their lives and not taken seriously because of it. So I think there are two issues there. The first being that women's literature is often tied to the circumstances of their life. Now, the kind of underlying assumption of that is that, women are so kind of self-obsessed or inwardly focused that the only thing that they're capable of doing is to write their versions of their life over and over again. So obviously that is a hugely problematic assumption and says a great deal about how we still think about women and still think about women's literature. I suppose the second issue there is this idea that if women do write about their lives and if they are writing kind of autobiographical fiction, that therefore it is of limited value. It is again too inwardly focused. It's only going to be of interest to other women. It's only going to be a kind of chaotic outpouring of emotion rather than a kind of crafted literary piece. I don't think that those accusations are levelled often at men's fiction. I think that when, say, somebody like, to use the example that Jeanette did, Paul Auster, I don't necessarily think that when a Paul Auster novel comes out, people pore over, is this a reference to X? Is this a reference to Y? How does this line up with the circumstances of their lives? But I think that impulse still exists when it comes to women's writing in a very kind of problematic way.
One of the things that fascinates me is the degree to which, when those autobiographical traces are found in the books of men's literature, it's often a means of mythologizing.
Yeah.
While when the same thing happens with women, it's a means of diminishing their achievement.
As you were talking, I was thinking of the word diminishing. Yeah. I think that's true. I mean, I remember Jamie Attenberg talking about this recently. So she writes I actually talked about her in the Best Books of 2017 show because I really liked her book, All Grown Up. And I remember her talking about that novel in an interview and saying that because she's a woman in her 40s who is single and she's written a book about a woman in her 40s who is single, the assumption is that this is just like a diary. that it was therefore unimportant and trivial because it was a diary. And she said, first of all, that's an assumption that you've made, that I'm writing about myself. I'm not writing about myself. I'm perhaps using, my own experiences and my lived reality as inspiration, but it's not a diary. And isn't that really trivializing for her to be reduced to like, okay, your novel is just like my thoughts on the single life?
Think about the kind of cult that builds up around the Beat Generation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a sort of mythology, or George Orwell, or all
or
of
someone
those
like Ernest Hemingway, even. Yeah,
absolutely. Where it's as though this life outside the text enhances both text and author.
Yeah, it makes it really mysteriously kind of cool, I suppose, in a way.
Yeah, whereas, the same doesn't happen with women. And you can see there that it's not it's not a sort of a structural thing so much as a sort of a perceptual sort of thing. And I think that it feels as though Winterson has contemplated this and decided to tackle it on both fronts by, sort of both sort of taking on autobiography and doing it so damn well that it gains its own stature, so that it ceases to be that lesser genre by showing it and doing it in this way that I think is, phenomenal. Because when you hear her talk about, say, for example, orange is not the only fruit, while she will not sort of draw, I think she talks about not ticking the boxes about what's real and what's not.
Yeah.
There's no effort to sort of diminish or downplay the amount of, sort of life that has, sort of generated that story. And I think she does that because it's always the case that the real is inflecting the fictions that we read.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And she's doing it in such a way that I think she's changing the way that we evaluate the category of autobiography, but also by being so playful and by crossing so many boundaries with that eye that carries through to fiction, to memoir, to this, to that. We're really sort of, as readers, forced to think very carefully before we sort of try and pigeonhole anything that she's doing.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that what's interesting about Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit is it seems on the surface, for those of you who don't know it, it seems on the surface to be about Jeanette. The main character is called Jeanette. It retreads the story of her life in many ways. So it's about a young girl growing up in a very conservative Christian household. She discovers her sexuality, etc., just as Jeanette's own life unfolded. As you said, she's resisted the urge to go, this is what's real, this is what's made up. But I think what she's doing there is drawing attention to the fact that all of our kind of autobiographical stories about ourselves are constructed as fictions, that the line between fiction and reality is very blurred. And that's not to diminish that form of writing or to say that this is just thinly veiled autobiography or something like that. But it's to point out that there is actually a very, very ambiguous kind of line between memoir, between novel, between any other form of writing, that all of these forms blend into each other and are consistently intertwined. I remember she says something in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit about how history is something to be played with. Yeah, and so she's very much interested in that idea of history is a construction. History is a story. Our lives are constructions. Our lives are a story. How we make sense of our lives, how we make sense of our kind of lives as autobiographies are stories. And so, to say something is autobiographical as a way of kind of diminishing it or suggesting that it's just, the outpouring of emotion or catharsis or something is to fundamentally misunderstand, I think, the nature of story and why we use it and what role it has in shaping the world for us.
Yeah, and I think she also locates in the fact that we're such storied beings that in a sense we can change the stories that we tell in a way that if we don't sort of have that understanding of ourselves, we can't. And I think what was interesting in one of the things that she sort of one of the avenues that she was discussing was the difference between faith and fundamentalism.
Yes.
And in somebody who grew up in such a strictly religious environment, she is so uniquely placed to think through the faith, because she says she's not a materialist, and she'll talk through the very sort of the potentials that are open to us when we don't sort of reduce things to sort of what can be proven or what can be quantified, but also when there is room for stories to change, which is obviously not something that's part of fundamentalism.
Yeah, well, exactly. And I mean, even looking at something like Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit, which was her first novel, written very obviously early in her career, and looking at something which is very new, which is the memoir, which seems to retread many of the incidents that happen in Oranges Are Not the Only Fruit. So the memoir, Why Be Happy When You Could Be Normal, came out in 2013. So there's, a good 30 years in between the writing of these two books. She does go back and kind of reassess not only the process of writing Orange Is Not the Only Fruit, but also goes back and reassesses all of these mythologies about her life that she's built up for herself, the way she's thought about her upbringing, the way she's thought about faith, as you say, the way that she's thought about her mother, and even her status as a kind of adopted child, a foundling. She goes back and she discovers who her birth parents are, and so forth. And so it's a process of kind of going over the story that she's created for herself in order to make sense of herself, and re-excavating that and showing that stories aren't these static kind of things, but they can be reassessed, retold, played with, and the way that you tell them, the different ways that you tell them, impacts upon the kind of meaning that you derive from them. So I think she comes to quite a different understanding of her family, of her mother, through that process of retelling their story at the beginning and very late in her career.
Yeah, and I think for me that's one of the things that really makes Winterson one of those exceptional writers, is that willingness to write what needs to be written in a particular moment. And that takes a lot of, I think that takes a lot of courage, because in that process of writing, and when I look at something like, sort of Weight or Sexing the Cherry or Written on the Body, or sort of in any of the stories that she does, is you can see that there are moments where she deliberately invokes, sort of strategies or deploys sort of characters or any of the number of things that she can do in ways that are distinctly unfashionable, that are distinctly out of mode, that are sort of flaunting readers' expectations by, sort of intruding. She'll intrude. There'll be that right. the intrusions that she's willing to make, where she tells you. And I think that so because there's always an aesthetic of any one era, that's sort of cooler, better, deemed more skillful, etc.
I'm going to improve upon the generation that came before me, kind of thing. Yeah,
I'm not going to tell you everything's going to be shown. I'm going to knit out, sort of the very sort of writer or author or out of the text, and all of those things, which are all just ruses. They're all just strategies. They're all just this. And what you can feel in those sort of moments of intrusiveness is somebody who doesn't care beyond what she has to say. And I think because every person, and particularly somebody as fiercely intelligent as Winterson, knows that dates you, it draws attention to you, all of those sorts of things, but she does it anyway, and that's what I love.
She's very different in her style, I think, as you say, to the kind of prevailing style of a lot of contemporary fiction. It doesn't read like much else that you can find. She has a kind of, I think, similarity to Ali Smith in some ways, but she doesn't write in the kind of popular mode of writing that especially you get out of the creative writing workshops in the US. She writes very, very differently and very idiosyncratically. And yes, the intrusive narrator, and sometimes she'll just stop and almost tell you how to interpret things or tell you the problems with something in quite an unexpected way. She has this way of being very kind of chatty with you as a reader at times. And then potentially withholding from you as well, that I find interesting. And she just, as you say, she doesn't care. Yeah. You know, she really, you can tell that she's not bound up at all in questions about, you know, how is this going to be received? How am I going to be on the forefront of literary fashion? Is this going to be the, you know, hot new book of 20 whatever? She just does what she has to do. And that has sometimes meant that she has not struggled to find an audience because she's very, very well known, but I think sometimes she could be bigger than she is because she just doesn't kind of play by the rules.
Absolutely, and because it also means that she gets mixed receptions with books because she varies so wildly. So somebody who is expecting this won't get that.
And, you know, I find that as well with her because, I mean, I've read pretty much, not everything that she's written, but I've read a lot of what she's written. And even sometimes I don't sit quite well with her book. Sometimes I've had mixed responses myself to what she's written. And I think that's just because there is no kind of prevailing style or prevailing kind of tone with her. It does vary, and she does have mixed responses. And you know, some books of Jeanette Winterson's I'll pick up and think, oh my God, this is so amazing, she's so clever. And then others I'll think, not quite sure I'm kind of getting what this is doing, or I'm not quite in the mind frame for it, or something like that.
And I think also because she's not afraid to have you not enjoy her books.
Yeah, that's right. I don't think she cares.
No.
Yeah.
And yet she does very intensely because, you know, she wants to reach people.
Yeah,
you can feel that. But
she knows that not everyone's going to be reached by every novel.
Yeah, and I think also she knows that sometimes you reach people by not reaching them. You know, by saying that actually maybe you're all just getting a little bit pretentious around this area.
Yeah.
So maybe you just need to have a book that just tells you it as it is and isn't afraid to tell rather than show, and isn't afraid to, you know, sort of show not the seams in a sort of a classy metafictive way, but just in a really profoundly consciously voiced, overvoiced, because I mean that's the other thing that she does, doesn't she? She overvoices things, which is a wonderful thing because it's naughty. It's like going and watching, you know, sort of something that's just, you know, it's like going and watching an 80s performance now, you know, and you know that it's so out, but then it just starts to feel so right, and it makes you challenge and realise the degree to which, you know, your tastes are actually being manufactured.
Yeah, and that's why I love that she goes and does things to, again, go back to that horror novel that she wrote a few years ago. I love that because I think that she does have this reputation as being a very heady, very intellectual kind of writer, and then she'll turn around and just give you almost a really, really conventional horror novel where she's like, yep, I can do this. You didn't expect it, did you? You were getting all up in my intellectual side, but here's just a really well written, but just straight horror.
Yeah.
I love it.
Yeah, look, I'm going to undoubtedly have to get hold of that one because I haven't read the...
It's really creepy, really creepy. I mean, I haven't read it. I think I read it the year it came out, which I think is about 2012. So it's been a while. But, yeah, it's just really well-written horror. Yeah. And you think, I love it that she can do that she can, you know, write all of these books that think through the nature of time and history and memory and myth. And then she'll turn around and say, here, horror.
Yeah, and I think there is that. I think what's also there is that there is this really sort of profound awareness of this ideal author type.
Yes, that
is there. You know, in the ethos of you know sort of the late 20th, early, you know, sort of 21st century, and it's going to be something that she completely tears down, and reminds us that, Shakespeare was just paid, as a paid
he was a working
work.
guy,
a worker, that throughout time, that there isn't that la-di-da author out there. That is
some
the
mystical
ideal
being, who exists above us all. Yeah.
No, there is this sort of working author who is that marvelous mix of, sort of the earthy, the profane, and the brilliant. Sort of the inspired, but also the sort of the sleeves rolled up. Working.
The kind of author who can just all of a sudden write a book about her favourite Christmas recipes and the decorations and games that she likes to play at Christmas.
Because she's not scared about her reputation.
She's not scared about her reputation. Other writers would be worried that would make them seem too, I don't know, downgrade or, too popular. But she's not scared. She just writes, I really like Christmas. It might be uncool, but I'm going to write...
What I like about Christmas.
What I like about Christmas. Yeah, exactly. Like, I like making fruitcake at Christmas. I like singing this song. And I like these decorations. And this is my favourite Christmas story. And why not? Who cares? That's something I like.
Moreover, it's once again putting another nail in that sort of fantasy idea of what an author should do.
Yes.
And I think that's, I think that's Winterson.
She's so great in person. If you ever get an opportunity to see her in person, I've seen her at the Sydney Writers' Festival a few times, and she just talks. She has no notes. She may have done kind of prep behind the scenes, but she just talks off the cuff. And you eat out of her hands. I remember seeing her talk just for an hour and a half in the Opera House, and she just came out, casual, jeans, T-shirt, just had a natter with us. And she's got such a beautiful accent, and she's just such an expressive speaker. And again, there was that missionary kind of, she was just zeal there, and getting the audience in by just telling us random stories about her life. It was amazing. I've never been so transfixed by somebody who appeared to be just talking off the cuff and and then there was interspersed in these stories about her life, she was talking about how she got in trouble for putting a banana in her handbag to eat at the airport, and customs got cranky at her, blah blah blah. Really, really,
she's a storyteller.
She's a storyteller.
Isn't that the essence of storytelling? Is the person who can sit down and make the banana in the handbag story.
Yeah, she can talk about Shakespeare and fundamentalist Christianity, and then she can also say, and hey, wasn't it super annoying when Australian customs wouldn't let me eat my banana?
Yeah,
which is true. It's very annoying. So yeah, she's just wonderful. I think we've actually completely run out of time. The door is going to be broken down any second now by other people who want to record their bon mots. Thank you, Michelle, for bringing Jeanette Winterson to the podcast. I think this has been super fun.
Stephanie, the pleasure is mine. Thank you.
So if you're looking for a book to read, you can really, really do no worse than Jeanette Winterson.
Yeah.
Go and read her. All right, so this has been another episode of From the Lighthouse. If you could please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, that would be very, very useful. Tell your friends, tell your mum, get everybody you know listening to the podcast. We love new listeners. If you've got any suggestions too, or recommendations of things we should read or shows that we should do in the future, you can just pop us a line at the Contact Us box on fromthelighthouse.org, and we'll see you again in a week. Bye.